Nathan's palm hit the table so hard my proposal jumped. "This is embarrassing, Lauren," he said, shaking his head like I'd just presented a crayon drawing. The room went silent. 15 executives stared at their laptops, suddenly fascinated by their screens. My stomach dropped. I'd worked on that pitch for 3 weeks straight, barely sleeping, double-checking every number. But Nathan wasn't done. "Childish," he added, leaning back in his leather chair with that smirk I'd learned to hate. "Naive, honestly." Someone coughed. His assistant pressed her lips together, fighting a smile. I stood frozen at the front of the room, my charts still glowing on the massive screen behind me. My throat tightened. Heat crawled up my neck, spreading across my cheeks. I wanted to defend myself, to explain why the data mattered, but my voice wouldn't come. Nathan had already moved on, flipping to the next agenda item like I hadn't just poured my best work onto that table. The humiliation burned through me like acid. Nobody defended me. Not one person spoke up. I couldn't breathe properly for the rest of that meeting. My hands shook under the table, so I gripped my pen until my knuckles went white. Nobody looked at me. Not Martin, who'd encouraged this proposal in the first place. Not the CFO who'd asked for innovation solutions just last month. Not the product director who'd told me privately that the company desperately needed fresh thinking. They all just sat there, letting Nathan's words hang in the air like smoke. When the meeting finally ended, people filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact. I gathered my things slowly, hoping my face didn't show how close I was to crying. In the bathroom, I locked myself in a stall and pressed my forehead against the cool metal door. My reflection in the mirror afterward looked like a stranger, pale and shocked. I'd been called aggressive before, too ambitious, even difficult. But childish, that word gutted me differently. It meant he didn't just disagree with my ideas. He didn't see me as a professional at all. I was a child playing dress-up in the grown-ups world. My name is Lauren Beck, and I'm 32 years old. Until that morning, I thought I'd finally made it into the room where real decisions happened. I was wrong. They'd brought me into Aurelian Tech 6 months earlier as a crisis consultant after the company missed 2 straight quarters. Investors were getting nervous. Clients were asking questions. The board wanted answers. My job was fixing their bleeding revenue streams and restructuring their product development timeline. I was good at it too. I'd saved them $4 million in the first quarter alone by identifying redundant processes and renegotiating supplier contracts. But being good at my job didn't mean they respected me. Nathan made sure I knew my place. I was a contractor, temporary help, someone useful but not permanent. He never let me forget it. After that meeting, walking back to my tiny borrowed office, I felt something shift inside me. The humiliation was still there, burning hot, but underneath it something colder had started forming. A quiet, calculating rage that would change everything. I wasn't leaving Aurelian defeated. Not anymore. The warning signs had been there from the beginning, obvious in retrospect. Nathan talked over me constantly, always with this dismissive hand wave like he was swatting away a fly. In meetings, he'd interrupt mid-sentence to redirect the conversation, never acknowledging what I'd just said. Once, after I solved a supplier contract issue his team had fumbled for weeks, he called it contractor energy and laughed. Everyone laughed with him. I laughed too back then. I thought I needed them to like me, to see me as part of the team. I hadn't learned yet that likability was a trap, a distraction from what actually mattered. Power, credibility, leverage. Those were the currencies that counted. I started keeping records after the 3rd time he took credit for my work. Nothing dramatic, just a simple folder on my laptop labeled Project Documentation. Screenshots of emails. Meeting notes with timestamps. Drafts with version histories showing who'd created what. I told myself it was just good practice, professional documentation in case questions arose later. But deep down I think I already knew. I was building a case, gathering ammunition for a war I didn't know I'd be fighting. The day after the Childish meeting, HR called me in. A woman named Caitlin sat across from me with an uncomfortable expression, like she'd rather be anywhere else. Her hands fidgeted with a folder she hadn't opened yet. "We've received feedback," she said carefully, not meeting my eyes. "Some executives felt yesterday's presentation was aggressive in tone." Aggressive. Another favorite word for women who spoke up, who had opinions, who didn't smile enough while being ignored. I kept my face neutral, professional. "Can you give me specific examples?" "Yes." She shuffled papers awkwardly. "Just, the general energy. Nathan felt you might need to dial it back a bit. Be more collaborative." Collaborative meant agreeable. Meant not challenging his authority. I meant knowing my place. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded slowly. "I understand. Thank you for the feedback." Walking out of that office, I felt something crystallize inside me. They wanted me quiet, grateful, and if I stayed that way, this would end with me escorted out by security, my work stolen, my name forgotten, just another woman who couldn't handle the pressure. So I made a decision right there in that sterile hallway with its fluorescent lights and corporate art. I wasn't going quiet. I was going strategic. I didn't expect to find an ally, but Marisol changed everything. She was Nathan's executive assistant, a quiet woman in her 50s who noticed everything and said very little. She'd been at Aurelian for 12 years, longer than Nathan, longer than most of the executive team. One afternoon, she stopped by my desk with a stack of folders. "These were supposed to go to finance," she said casually, setting them down. "But I thought you might want to see them first." Some numbers seemed off. Inside were budget reports Nathan had amended, cutting my data sources and inflating his department's contributions. There were also emails, forwarded without comment, showing him pitching my frameworks as his own ideas to the board. Marisol didn't explain why she was sharing this. She just gave me that tight, knowing smile and walked away. After that, she became my eyes and ears inside the executive suite. Calendar invites that got mysteriously changed. Documents that were accidentally, not deleted from shared drives. Financial discrepancies that seemed worth noting. She never said why she was helping me, but I understood. She'd watched this pattern before, seen talented people crushed by Nathan's ego, and she was tired of watching good people lose. My contract was up in 60 days. I could fight, file complaints, make noise about discrimination and a hostile work environment. But I'd seen how that story ended for women in tech. The woman becomes difficult, emotional, unable to work with others. A problem to be managed and quietly removed. Her reputation follows her. Future employers hear whispers. Doors close. Instead, I finished my work quietly and professionally. I delivered every report on time, attended every meeting with a pleasant smile, thanked Nathan for his feedback even when it contradicted itself. I played the role they wanted perfectly. But I was also gathering everything I needed. Public financial records showed something interesting about Aurelian's vendor payments. A consulting firm called Apex Strategic had received over $500,000 in the last year for innovation advisory services. The invoices were vague, professional-looking but empty of actual detail. Funny thing was, I couldn't find any reports they'd delivered, any meetings they'd attended, any work they'd actually done. I dug deeper through public business registrations. Apex Strategic was registered to an address in Delaware, same as hundreds of shell companies. Its listed partner. Someone with Nathan's middle name and his mother's maiden name. Floppy. Arrogant. Perfect. 3 days before my contract ended, I reached out to Olive Reyes. She was a board member at Aurelian, a venture capitalist who'd made her reputation backing overlooked founders, particularly women and minorities that traditional VCs ignored. She'd spoken once on a panel about diversifying leadership in tech, about how companies failed when they only listened to one type of voice, one perspective, one background. I'd kept her card, tucked it into my wallet after that panel. Now I am using it. "I'd love to buy you coffee," I wrote simply. "Pick your brain about emerging markets and innovation frameworks." She agreed to lunch at a quiet restaurant downtown, away from Aurelian's usual spots. I brought my original proposal, the one Nathan had called Childish. I didn't mention him or the meeting. I just walked her through the framework, the data, the projected outcomes if implemented correctly. Olive leaned back in her chair, studying the pages carefully. "This is solid work," she said finally. "Actually, it's exactly what Aurelian needs right now. The board has been asking for innovation strategies. Have they implemented any of this?" I smiled carefully. "Not yet." I didn't tell her about Nathan's rejection. I didn't have to. She was smart enough to ask the next question herself. My last day at Aurelian felt surreal, like moving through a dream. I packed my desk, returned my badge, said polite goodbyes to the few people who'd been kind. Nathan didn't even acknowledge my departure. Didn't say thank you for the $4 million I'd saved his company. But before I left, I did one final thing. I printed a clean copy of my proposal and slid it into an envelope. On a yellow sticky note, I wrote in neat print, "You'll need this in 90 days. The data doesn't lie." I left it in the strategy team's shared folder, buried in archived files where nobody would find it immediately, but where it would surface eventually when they went looking for answers. Then I walked out of that building for what I thought might be the last time. The afternoon sun was bright, almost blinding. Felt lighter. Not because I was done with Aurelian, but because I'd finally stopped pretending. No more performing gratitude for people who didn't value me. No more shrinking myself to fit their comfort. No more accepting crumbs and calling it an opportunity. I drove home, poured a large glass of wine, and waited. Because I knew something they didn't. The storm was already coming, dark clouds gathering on their horizon. 8 weeks later, Aurelian's quarterly earnings report dropped like a bomb. It was bad. Really bad. Revenue fell 18% year over year. 2 major clients had left for competitors. Product launches were delayed indefinitely. The stock price fell 12% in a single day, wiping out millions in market value. I watched it happen from my apartment, tracking the news coverage and analyst reports on 3 different screens. The tech blogs were brutal. Leadership crisis at Aurelian Tech. Innovation stalls as competition surges. Once promising startup loses its way. One article quoted an anonymous employee. "We've lost our way. Nobody knows who's steering the ship anymore. Morale is at an all-time low." Nathan tried damage control, scheduling a high-profile conference presentation to reassure investors and rebuild confidence. I watched the live stream from my laptop. He was using my framework badly, with half the data points wrong and conclusions that didn't match the analysis. He fumbled basic questions from analysts, got defensive when pressed on specifics, blamed external market conditions instead of internal failures. By the end, social media was roasting him. Someone made a meme comparing his charts to a kindergarten art project. The irony was delicious. He'd called my work childish. Now his stolen version was a laughingstock. Marisol sent me a text message at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Just a photo, no words needed. It showed Nathan through a glass wall, pacing outside the boardroom. His face bright red, tie loosened. Even through the blurry phone camera, I could see his panic. The board had called an emergency meeting. The audit had started. I'd tipped off Olive about the Apex strategic payments weeks earlier during a casual follow-up coffee. I noticed something odd in the public filings while I was reviewing vendor relationships, I'd said, showing her the pattern on my tablet. Probably nothing, but it seemed worth checking. Just unusual payment amounts and frequencies. She'd gone very still, then thanked me quietly and changed the subject. I knew that look. She was already planning her next move. Now I understand why. The board had hired forensic accountants, the expensive kind that specialized in corporate fraud. They'd found the shell company, traced the payments through multiple accounts, and discovered that Nathan had been funneling the innovation budget into his own pocket for over a year. $500,000 that should have funded actual product development. Instead, it had paid for his beach house renovation in California. The evidence was damning, detailed, impossible to explain away. The executive exodus started quietly, like rats leaving a sinking ship. First, the CFO announced he was pursuing other opportunities. His LinkedIn profile was updated the same day. Then 2 VPs left in the same week, both taking positions at competitors. HR posted emergency openings for C-level positions but couldn't fill them. Nobody wanted to board a sinking ship, not with Nathan's scandal spreading through industry networks. Meanwhile, I'd started consulting for 2 of Aurelian's competitors, building the reputation Nathan had tried to bury. My LinkedIn inbox is flooded with messages daily. Speaking invitations, partnership offers. Companies want to implement my frameworks. The proposal he'd mocked was now being praised across the industry as innovative, forward-thinking, exactly what tech companies needed. A startup founder told me she'd based her entire business model on a framework I'd published in a trade journal. She'd just closed series of funding, $8 million from top-tier VCs. "You changed my career," she wrote. "I was about to give up. Your work showed me I was on the right path." I saved that message in a special folder. On particularly hard days when doubt crept in, I read it again to remind myself that the work mattered, even when the people in power couldn't see it. Recognition always came eventually. Sometimes it just took burning down the building to clear the view. Olive called me on a Tuesday morning in late September. "Lauren, I need to ask you something confidential." Her voice was careful, measured, with that serious tone that meant big decisions were being made. "The board is considering a significant leadership change at Aurelian. We're looking for someone who understands the company's challenges but isn't tied to the current problems. Someone with a fresh perspective and proven strategic capability." She paused meaningfully. "Would you be interested in a conversation?" My heart hammered against my ribs. Kept my voice calm, professional. "What kind of role are we discussing?" "We'll discuss specifics in person," she said. "But Lauren, this would be substantial. Not consulting. Not advisory. Actual leadership with full authority." I agreed to meet that Friday. After hanging up, I sat very still in my apartment, staring at the wall where morning light painted shadows. They wanted me back. The company that had humiliated me, that had called my work childish and told me to dial back my ambition, had let Nathan crush me in front of 15 executives without a single person speaking up. Now they needed me to save them. The symmetry was almost too perfect. Almost. But I wasn't doing this for poetic justice. I was doing it because I'd earned it, because I was the best person for the job, because the work deserved to be implemented correctly. The board meeting happened in a private conference room downtown, away from Aurelian's office and curious eyes. 5 board members sat around the polished table, Olive included. They laid out the situation bluntly, with the kind of honesty that comes when options have run out. Nathan was being removed for cause. The audit had uncovered financial misconduct that made his position untenable, potentially criminal. But the company was also hemorrhaging talent and losing market confidence. Stock analysts were downgrading. Clients were asking pointed questions. They needed a turnaround, fast and visible. "We've reviewed your original proposal," one board member said, a silver-haired woman I recognized from quarterly reports. "The one from 6 months ago. It's exactly what we should have implemented immediately. Our current crisis might have been avoided entirely." Another added, "We also spoke to your recent clients. The feedback is exceptional. You have a reputation for fixing broken systems and rebuilding trust." Olive leaned forward, her expression serious. "Lauren, we'd like to offer you the CEO position. Not interim. Not acting. Not temporary. Permanent, with full operational authority and board support." The room went silent. They were watching me carefully, waiting for my response. I thought about that conference room where Nathan had humiliated me. About Caitlin telling me to be less aggressive. About every man who'd interrupted me, dismissed me, stolen my ideas. Then I thought about Marisol. About the startup founder. About every woman who'd written to thank me for speaking up. I met Olive's eyes steadily. "I wanted in writing. Complete contract with full terms before I give you an answer." The contract negotiations took 2 weeks of careful back and forth. I didn't rush. I asked for everything I wanted. Full operational authority over all departments, board seats with voting rights, a competitive equity package that would vest over 4 years, complete control over executive hiring and firing, and protection clauses that prevented the board from undermining my decisions. They could have pushed back, haggled, and tried to limit my power. Instead, they agreed to everything. That told me how desperate they were, how bad things had really gotten. Nathan's misconduct had done more damage than they'd admitted publicly. The ship wasn't just sinking. It was already halfway underwater, taking on water faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. When they handed me the final contract, I read every word twice before signing, checking every clause and subclauses. No surprises. No hidden limitations. Just a clear, binding agreement that put me in charge of the company that had tried to erase me. I signed in blue ink, my signature sharp and certain across the bottom line. Olive shook my hand firmly. "Welcome back, Lauren. We're counting on you." Smiled. "Let's get to work." They scheduled the announcement for the following Monday. Press release, internal memo, investor call. Everything coordinated to control the narrative and prevent leaks. Nathan wouldn't get a farewell speech. No goodbye party. No thank you email. Just a quiet escort out of the building with a settlement agreement and an NDA. Clean. Professional. Brutal. The night before my first day, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, but from energy coursing through my veins. I kept thinking about that moment in the conference room, Nathan's hand slamming the table. His voice dripping with contempt. Childish. Leave. Embarrassing. Words designed to make me small, to put me in my place, to remind me I didn't belong in rooms like that. Tomorrow I'd walk into his office, sit in his chair, run his company. The story could end there, with simple revenge, with me taking his place and him losing everything. But that wasn't enough. Revenge was temporary satisfaction, a moment of triumph that faded. What I wanted was permanence, lasting change. I wanted to rebuild Aurelian into something he could never have created, something that valued ideas over ego. I wanted every person he'd dismissed and undermined to have opportunities he'd denied them. I wanted his failure to become the foundation for something better, something that actually worked. That would hurt more than any public humiliation. It would prove that everything he'd believed about himself, about leadership, about who deserved power, was fundamentally wrong. And nothing cuts deeper than being proved comprehensively, undeniably wrong. I arrived at Aurelian at 7:30 a.m., 90 minutes before the official announcement. Security recognized me from before but looked confused, uncertain how to process my presence. "Ms. Beck, are you consulting again?" the guard asked, hand hovering near his phone. I smiled warmly. "Something like that. You'll get the memo soon." The executive floor was empty and quiet, that eerie stillness of corporate spaces before people arrived. I walked slowly down the hallway, past offices where I'd been ignored and meeting rooms where I'd been interrupted. Everything looked the same. The bland carpet, the motivational posters about teamwork and innovation, the coffee station that never worked properly. But I was different. Everything had changed. I reached the CEO's office at the end of the hall, the door still labeled with Nathan's name on a brass plate. Inside, the space was exactly how I'd imagined from glimpses through the glass walls. Massive mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive abstract art on the walls. The chair was real leather, probably cost more than my first car. I sat down carefully, testing the feel. Tall. He'd liked looking down at people, literally and figuratively. I lowered it 3 inches, then turned to face the window. The city spread out below, morning light catching on glass towers. From up here, everything looked possible. Clean. Manageable. I understood why Nathan had loved this view. And why he'd been so terrified of losing it. The announcement hit at 9 a.m. sharp. Email to all staff. Press release to media. Notification to investors. Aurelian Tech announces a new CEO. My name in bold letters. My photo on the company website, professional and confident. Within minutes, my phone exploded with notifications. Text messages from old colleagues. Emails from former clients. LinkedIn notifications scrolled so fast I couldn't read them. Former colleagues congratulated me. Competitors asking for meetings. Journalists requesting interviews. Investors wanting reassurance calls. In the office, I heard the news spreading like wildfire. Voices in hallways, people gathering around computers, the buzz of shocked conversation. Someone knocked on my door hesitantly. A junior engineer I barely knew, maybe 25, with nervous energy. "Ms. Beck, I just wanted to say this means a lot. To a lot of us." His voice cracked slightly. We were scared about what would happen next. People were updating resumes, talking about leaving. Now we think maybe things can get better. After he left, I locked the door and sat very still, letting the weight sink in. This wasn't just about Nathan anymore. This wasn't about revenge or justice or proving a point. People were depending on me. Real people with mortgages and families and careers they'd built. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders. Heavy and real and terrifying. I couldn't mess this up. I wouldn't. Nathan's exit was scheduled for 11 a.m. I didn't attend. That felt petty, performative, like I needed to watch him suffer. Instead, Olive handled it with 2 security guards and an HR representative. They met him in a conference room on a lower floor, presented the settlement agreement, and gave him 30 minutes to clear his personal items under supervision. Marisol texted me updates in real time. "He's arguing with Olive. She's not budging." 10 minutes later. "He's packing. Looks angry. Security watching everything." Then finally, "He's gone. Didn't look back. Left through the side entrance." I imagined him walking out of the building for the last time, carrying a cardboard box of personal photos and awards that suddenly meant nothing. The humiliation must have been crushing, the shock of losing everything he'd taken for granted. But he'd earned every bit of it through years of arrogance and cruelty. But I didn't dwell on it long. I had actual work to do. By noon, I'd scheduled meetings with every department head for the next 3 days. By 2 p.m., I'd reviewed the current project pipeline and financial projections. By 4 p.m., I'd identified 3 critical problems Nathan had been ignoring or hiding. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival. And I was very good at surviving. My first week was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. 18-hour days, emergency meetings, crisis management, constant firefighting. The company was in worse shape than the board had admitted, maybe worse than they'd known. Product development was months behind schedule on multiple projects. Client relationships were damaged, trust eroded. Employee morale was in the basement, people scared and demoralized. But I dealt with worse in previous turnarounds. I assembled a core team quickly. Marisol as chief of staff, recognizing her institutional knowledge and loyalty. 2 new VPs I'd worked with previously at other companies, people I trusted completely. And a CFO who actually understood technology finance instead of just reading spreadsheets. We worked fast, cutting dead projects that drained resources, refocusing on core products, rebuilding trust with key clients through honest conversations. I held all-hands meetings where I actually answered questions honestly instead of corporate doublespeak. Revolutionary concept. "We're in trouble," I told the staff bluntly. "But we're not dead. Here's exactly what we're doing to fix it." People responded to honesty. Not everyone, not immediately. But enough. The engineers started hitting deadlines again. Sales stopped the bleeding, even closed 2 new deals. Product launched a delayed feature that actually worked properly. Small wins. But wins nonetheless. By Friday, I collapsed into my apartment at midnight, exhausted but energized in a way I hadn't felt in years. This was harder than I'd expected. It was also exactly what I'd wanted. 3 weeks into my tenure, I found something disturbing in Nathan's old files. A folder labeled Strategic Plans, buried deep in the shared drive. Password protected, but Marisol knew the password. Inside were proposals from the last 3 years. All rejected. All from people Nathan had eventually forced out or marginalized. A product innovation from a VP who'd quit after being passed over for promotion twice. A market expansion strategy from a director who'd left for a competitor. My own proposal, filed and forgotten like it never existed. Every single one was brilliant. Every single one would have prevented or minimized Aurelian's current crisis if implemented even partially. Nathan hadn't just failed to innovate. He'd actively killed innovation because it didn't come from him, because it threatened his authority, because he couldn't tolerate anyone else being right. The realization made me furious all over again. How many people had he crushed? How many good ideas had died because they threatened his fragile ego? How much value had been destroyed by his insecurity? I printed them all, every single proposal. Reached out to every person who'd written them through LinkedIn. "We're implementing your proposal," I told them in personal messages. "With full credit and proper compensation. Want to come back and lead it yourself?" Most said yes immediately. By month 2, the turnaround was becoming visible to outsiders. Stock price stabilized, then crept upward. Clients renewed contracts they'd been considering canceling. Media coverage shifted from crisis mode to cautiously optimistic. New leadership brings fresh direction to Aurelian Tech. Can Lauren Beck save Aurelian? One journalist asked me directly about Nathan during an interview. "He called your proposal childish in front of the executive team. How does it feel to prove him wrong so completely? I could have torn him apart publicly. Could have detailed every mistake, every act of financial misconduct, every person he'd crushed." The journalist wanted that story. But I'd learned something important over the past months. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's irrelevant. Nathan and I had different visions for the company, I said carefully, diplomatically. I'm focused on executing mine and building something sustainable. The past is the past. I'm interested in the future. Later, Olive told me that restraint had impressed the board deeply. You could have buried him publicly. Destroyed whatever reputation he has left. He chose not to. That's real leadership. But privately I knew the truth. Nathan was already buried under the weight of his own failures. Every successful quarter, every innovation launched, every talented person we hired back, every single one was another shovel of dirt on top. He'd spend the rest of his career explaining why he lost Aurelian. I'd spend mine building something better. That was the real victory. 6 months in, we launched the innovation program based on my original proposal. The one Nathan had called childish and embarrassing. It became our most successful initiative in 3 years, exactly as my projections had predicted. Client adoption exceeded projections by 40% in the first quarter. Revenue from new products hit $8 million, completely reversing the previous year's decline. Industry publications called it revolutionary, a model for other companies. Awards followed quickly. Tech Innovator of the Year. Best Product Launch. Top CEO to Watch. I accepted them on behalf of the team, always crediting the engineers and designers who'd done the actual implementation work. Recognition belonged to everyone. But I kept one award on my desk where I could see it daily. Tech Leader of the Year. The plaque was heavy, brass and glass, substantial. Sometimes during long days I'd pick it up, feeling the weight. Remembering that conference room. Nathan's face twisted with contempt. The word childish hangs in the air like poison. The humiliation burned through me. Then I'd set it down carefully and get back to work. The award didn't matter ultimately. The work mattered. The people mattered. Building something that lasted, that meant something, that changed lives mattered. Everything else was just noise and ego. A year after I became CEO, I got an unexpected message through LinkedIn. Nathan's former assistant, the one who'd smiled when he humiliated me in that meeting. She was looking for work, her profile showing she'd left Aurelian shortly after Nathan. Her resume was genuinely impressive, strong skills and experience. But I remembered that smile, that moment of cruelty. I could have ignored her application, deleted it without comment. Instead, I called her in for an interview, curious what she'd say. She looked nervous, defensive, like she expected me to attack her. "I know what you're thinking," she said before I could speak. About that meeting. About me smiling. I was wrong. I should have said something. I should have defended you. I studied her carefully. Why didn't you? She looked away, shame coloring her face. Because I wanted to keep my job. Because Nathan had power and you didn't. Because I was scared of becoming his next target. He paused. It's not an excuse. But it's the truth. Honesty. Finally raw and uncomfortable. I hired her as a project coordinator. Nowhere near the executive level. Not as punishment, but as a reset. A chance to prove herself differently. You get one chance, I told her seriously. Don't waste it. 6 months later she was one of my best team members, loyal and hardworking. She'd learned what Nathan never did. That real power doesn't come from crushing people. Comes from lifting them up. 2 years after that humiliating meeting, I stood in the same conference room with the same long table and massive screen. Different executives sat around it now. Most of them people I'd hired personally, people who shared my vision. We were reviewing next quarter's strategy, planning the next phase of growth. Someone presented a proposal that needed work, rough around the edges. I stopped them halfway through, but gently. This framework isn't quite there yet, I said carefully. But the core idea is solid and worth developing. Let's workshop it together, see if we can strengthen it. The room stayed engaged instead of checking out. People asked questions respectfully. Offer suggestions constructively. Built on the original concept until it was stronger, better, actually implementable. Later the presenter thanked me privately. I appreciate you not just shutting it down. My last boss would have destroyed me for presenting something imperfect. I smiled, understanding exactly what they meant. Good ideas don't come fully formed. They need space to grow, to be challenged constructively, to evolve. That's how innovation actually works. Walking back to my office, I passed Nathan's old nameplate, now replaced with mine in the same brass finish. Lauren Beck, Chief Executive Officer. People think revenge means fire and fury, public humiliation and dramatic exits, explosive confrontations and destroyed reputations. But mine came in quiet victories and steady progress. In building the company Nathan couldn't because his ego blocked every path forward. In proving that the work he'd mocked was exactly what Aurelian needed to thrive. In showing up every day and doing the job he'd said I wasn't serious enough to handle. I didn't just replace him. I erased him completely, made him irrelevant. And that was better than any revenge I could have imagined. Because the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so successful that people forget the person who came before ever existed.